Welcome back to the Church Renewal Podcast. My name is Alan Edwards. I'm your host, and I'm the Director of Operations at Flourish Coaching. The Church Renewal Podcast is a ministry of Flourish. At Flourish, we exist to set ministry leaders free with the gospel to be effective wherever God has called them, so that when pastors and churches feel stuck, our coaches come alongside them, renew their hope in the gospel, and help them gain some strategic clarity. On the podcast this week, we are continuing our Renewal Stories series. The Renewal Stories series is where we tell the tales of the way Jesus has been personally renewing ministry leaders or equipping ministry leaders to lead renewal, revitalizing, replanting in their context. So if you're a regular listener to the podcast, you know that we interview thought leaders, we talk about the ideas of church renewal, we take listener questions, and we like to tell stories about what God is doing. This week on the podcast, we are talking about the story of our dear leader. Wait, that's what they call the leader.
Yes, comrade.
We are telling the story of Matt Bowling, who is the executive director at Flourish. We're peeling back the curtain. We want you to understand how and why we came to work in this space in the church. So, come along, dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church through a Flourish renewal story today. All right, Matt, we are here for part 2 of your personal renewal story. Don't worry, it's not going to get too painful or cathartic. What happens when an Antarctic explorer has an existential crisis? He gets cathartic.
Oh, it's terrible.
Last time we talked, Matt, you said that going into your second pastorate, you were beginning to approach it differently. You had been through some renewal revitalization training, and you were going to have a different approach to the second church that you pastored. So let's pick the story up there. What was the difference? How did you approach your new church differently?
I think a couple ways. I think most significantly, one is that I realized that reasserting the gospel as central to the life of the church was really, really critical. That wasn't even my framework when I went to the first church. And by the time I went to the second church, I realized that it was the most critical thing that I could do. In my preaching, in our teaching of adults and discipleship, we really tried to get people to understand that they needed to learn how to understand the gospel accurately and apply it broadly. Go more deeply with the gospel and apply it more broadly. That's what we see Paul do in his letters. He'll see an issue in a congregation, and for Paul, every issue is a gospel issue. And so he repreaches the gospel to them and then teaches them how to apply that gospel. And that's what we did in our congregants' life, which was wonderful. I remember, can I share one brief story?
Yeah,
we
please.
were in a adult Sunday school class and talking about the gospel and the nature of the gospel. And a 50-year-old man walked up to me after the class and he said, I think you said in class today that God couldn't love me any more than he does right now. And I said, yeah, he loves you for Jesus' sake. He set his love on you. He couldn't love you any more than he does right now. He said, do you know in all my years in the church that no one ever told me that before?
Wow.
50 years. And no one had told him that God's love was like that. And so when you have a congregation of people who have never been told that, of course they're going to be mixed up. Their priorities, the church's priorities, going to have lost focus on the Great Commission, right? Because if you're not experiencing the gospel yourself, you don't want to give it away because you don't really feel like it's all that big a deal anyways. And so
if it's not working for you,
it's not working
if you
for
don't
you.
know love like this, what do you have to give away?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't have a well of love to draw from, and you can't really authentically talk about God's love because you're kind of not sure if you're buying it yourself anyways, right? Or if it's that good. And so we reasserted the gospel from day one. I think that the second thing that was different was that I realized much more clearly that I was in a leadership role. I was a pastor who was there to lead. And I think in my first church, I was just a pastor. And only along the way did I realize, oh, I'm supposed to be leading. The second church I went into, I knew that I was supposed to be leading from day one going in. That was a really big difference. It changed my mindset about the way that I even talked to the church before I was there. Even we did a retreat. Sometime we'll do a podcast on retreats, but we did a retreat within the first 2 months that I was at the church. We'd started to take the leadership away. because we knew that we needed to try and find a clear vision for the church going forward. And so I learned that from Harry Reeder, and it was exactly what the church needed. And so my approach going in was very, very different. And that was to the good, because we were able to get within the first year to a really solid vision for the church that led us forward for years and years. And so that was really, really critical.
So for listeners who might have missed the last episode, your first church had been recently planted and was really just struggling with identity and mission, and you had this personal transformation while there. At your second church, they had declined by 50% over 10 years, and most of the congregation was over 75 when you got there, and they knew they needed some change.
Right.
In those first couple years, what were the first steps you took toward helping recast their vision and reimagine who they might be as a church of Jesus Christ?
So I preached through the book of Acts.
Okay.
Which
Why Acts?
Because I really felt like if you're going to try and help a church get back oriented around the Great Commission, then you ought to see, why do churches exist and what does it look like when a church is vital? And so Acts seemed very natural to me to do. So that was one thing, at least a lot with the congregation, teaching about the gospel. And then I spent a lot of time with the leadership, a lot of conversations, several retreats, a session and leadership meetings that were oriented around us thinking carefully about our church and how to lead it forward. And so it was very, consuming and wonderful because people knew that they needed something different and they wanted somebody to lead them. It wasn't perfect. We certainly ran into a fair number of bumps along the way, but it was substantially different than the way I went about it the first time, for which I'm actually really, really grateful that I'd had all that training and experience and was able to go apply it.
Yeah.
And so that's the first couple of things that pop into my head.
Okay. And a few years in, you had come to this church. They had a building that outsized them. They had a...
Dwarfed would be the right word.
Dwarfed.
Sanctuary of 600. I have the sign behind me in my office to remind me. The main floor sat 577 with a balcony that sat another 100.
Wow.
And we would sit in there and worship at 60 people.
Wow.
In a sanctuary made for 600.
10 times.
10 times.
10 times bigger.
We were ants.
Yeah. Yeah. I can imagine.
Which led us actually to do a renovation. We did a renovation of the sanctuary where we cut off part of the space. This is crazy. I don't even know if I ever told you this.
No.
We actually put up a theater wall.
Okay.
We redid the windows. We did the significant renovation to make it into a more intimate space.
Right.
We made a smaller platform that was closer to people. And so, and I think that particular move was one of the tools in the bag that as people would come to the church, they'd go, okay, these people recognize that this place needed to be different. And we did a significantly different thing by doing that renovation.
Yeah. Now, I know one of the things along the way you that helped guide you make those decisions was that you revisioned.
Right.
And in that process of revisioning, you all had to make some decisions about the team you had at your church.
Yeah.
I know this is not an easy conversation to have because it involves people that aren't here in the room that you love and care about. But
sure.
But it was one of the challenges of leading change in a church, and that was thinking about your staff.
Yeah.
So this is about 2011.
2011,
right?
yeah.
So this is about 9 years ago.
Right.
And a couple things are happening at your church all at once. So why don't you kind of set the scene for us? What's happening at your church?
Yes.
And what does that have to do with renewing your church?
Yeah. So in 2011, we're still in this enormous building. We'd done the renovation. It had begun to take hold a little bit, but our budget was under a lot of pressure. We were carrying 2 pastors on staff with a small congregation. And I sort of looked at the budget in early 2011, and I could kind of see the writing on the wall that it felt like to me that by the end of the year, we probably were not going to be a 2-pastor church. And so I told my associate pastor what I honestly felt, which was if I was you, looking at the budget the way that it is right now, I'd probably start looking for another job. And I was being honest and forthright and clear because I would have wanted somebody to say that to me.
Right.
That turned out to be calamitous.
That conversation.
I didn't know it at the time because it was just 2 guys in a room talking and me being what I thought was kind. Because I could see what was coming. And I knew that if the church had to go down to 1 pastor, it was going to be me because I was the one that they had called, and the church had experienced some renewal already. And so anyways, but that set off a firestorm that I didn't realize at the moment that would come to fruition late in that same year in 2011.
Yeah.
But again, that was sort of hidden at that time. But we had a piece of property on the market to sell, and we had sort of adopted a budget by faith, thinking that if that piece of property sold, that we could keep 2 pastors on and we could keep doing what we were trying to do. And eventually later that year, I'll come back to another incident in that year that's important, but later in that year, the sale of that piece of property fell through. And we found ourselves with 9 months of runway.
Right.
Or else we were done.
Right.
And so that culminated in actually another elder and I having a conversation with that staff member to say, hey, here's the two options are we can pay you severance or we can have you be part-time next year, but that's what we've got available to us because we're going to run out of money. That was not taken well. There's things that could have been done a lot better in that process that I understand on my part.
Yeah.
Way, way better on my part. The staff member that we ended up separating from, I had not insisted on having a job description. I had not made sure that there were regular reviews done by the session of either me or him. And so, but that doesn't mean that reviews weren't happening.
Yeah.
It just means that they weren't public.
So
They
really,
weren't known.
If we can pause for a moment and go from the experience to the idea.
Yeah.
One of the things we talk about in Church Renewal, on the one hand, is growing in emotional and relational intelligence. And this was a moment where sorry for saying it to your face, but you kind of fell on your face.
Absolutely.
Emotionally and relationally.
Absolutely.
And did not handle it well. And then another piece of Church Renewal is beginning to be strategic and tactical. And so this is a place where having a strategy and being tactical about how we're going to do what God's called us to do and being relational, where these two things crashed into each other.
Yep.
What did you learn from that? How did it shape you moving forward in Church Renewal?
Well, later, I ran into Pete Scazzaro stuff, and I realized that I had run into the same kind of issues as a person that a lot of pastors do, which I think helped me realize that I wasn't uniquely an idiot. I was a common
idiot.
I was a common idiot.
Which is emotionally healthy spirituality for people who haven't heard of him. Okay, go ahead.
So so if you operate in a conflict averse way, there's all kinds of things that you don't do in leadership that you ought to. And that had been me up to that point. I had been conflict averse. There was an elder on the session that was very conflict averse. And so there might have been some spaces, some things that I might have walked towards by myself, but in dialogue, I ended up not. And that was really a big mistake. And so I would say that that's probably the biggest mistake. The reason, no matter what, more than likely, no matter what, when we separated from this staff member, whether it had been at the end of a progression of conversations, or whether it was in the fashion that we did it, which was poor, it was probably going to have some damage. But we probably did it in the way that it had the most damage.
Yeah.
Which is that we, after the dust settled from that, as an elder board, we were standing on the cliff with our toes over the edge going, there's the cliff. And we thought that the church might close then, period.
Yeah. So before we go into what happened next, this reminds me of something that I hear you tell pastors all the time, which is that Church Renewal is more than, but definitely not less than, a series of thoughtful, humble, and confident, sensitive, but challenging conflicts.
Absolutely.
It is nothing less than a series of conflicts.
Yep, a series of chosen staged conflicts.
Chosen staged conflicts.
Yeah.
Is this one of the things that helped shape you in thinking, wow, we need to do conflict better if we're going to lead change in churches?
Absolutely. So I think that you can be somebody who's trigger happy about conflict, and you just walk towards every single one and tell people off, and
sure.
That's
pugilistic.
What's that?
Pugilistic.
Yes.
Yeah. I like a fight.
I like a fight, and I do not wish to be that kind of person. But I allowed myself to be a kind of person where I saw something. We'll bastardize the TSA logo here. I saw something and I didn't say something. not at all. Not kindly, not thoughtfully, not humbly confident, not, hey, we should really talk about this, right? But just nothing. And here's what I tell pastors now on the backside of this experience. You imagine in your mind the consequences that could happen if you choose to have a conflict. And because they're very clear to you, you think that, so you avoid the conflict. But meanwhile, you're taking casualties all the time while you're not walking towards that conflict. We lost another leader in that same era who had a run-in with everybody in the church.
Oh, yeah.
He was a very, very strong personality. And I, had avoided conflict with him as well. And so all of this conflict aversion ended up blowing up anyways. And so you have the blow up you fear, so you don't walk towards conflict, but all the time the pressure is still building. The Sunday after both of those leaders left, you walked into our worship service and the pressure in the room was gone.
Interesting.
And I felt so foolish that I'd become so used to that pressure that I'd allowed everybody to be underneath it. And so that's my gentle encouragement to pastors to not avoid it. It's because if something needs to be dealt with, no matter what you fear about it, you still got to deal with it. And one of the reasons why I recommend to pastors that they read Crucial Conversations, that's one of the most important books you could possibly read. And I mean that because they lead you through how to have these difficult conversations with people, and they give you church-based examples. And it's absolutely incredible to get that training and get that into your head and learn how to have these difficult conversations, because they're always there. And they always need to be had, because we're unsanctified and so are other people. But the only way that changes many times is that you are willing to have a conversation with them. Here's the reason why this is so burdensome to me. What happens when I see someone's unsanctification and I don't walk towards them with love to talk to them about it? They don't see it. The people around them aren't saying anything to them, but I see it. Mm-hmm. And if I don't walk towards them, I deprive them of the opportunity of growing.
Yeah.
That's hard to live with.
That's not loving.
It's not loving.
It's seeing a guy with impaired vision walking toward a cliff and thinking, "Oh, I don't want to offend him."
Right. And it's not loving. It's exactly right. You deprive somebody the opportunity to grow. Yeah. And I did that countless times, not just these couple of years, but I did that countless times.
Has this experience, let's just call it what it is, has your past failure to do that well changed the way you receive it from other people?
Oh yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think that in the same era, I ran into some really good materials on how to receive criticism as a pastor, and it really changed me. It changed my view of receiving from other people and being willing to give to other people. So a couple of years after this really difficult set of circumstances, we ran into another incident at our church where a leader needed to be confronted. But I'd had this background. I knew that I needed to walk towards it. I had Crucial Conversations in my back pocket, and we went through the whole conflict. The leader ended up leaving the church, but it was peaceable, and there was no regret, because I knew that although I couldn't control the outcome, I could control the way that I engaged with it. And that's all Jesus holds me responsible for. As much as it depends upon you, be at peace with all men. As much as it depends upon you, right? So there's that differentiation. There's a line in the desk between you and I. I need to take care of my side of the line. But part of my side of the line is, brother, I see that you had a run-in with almost everybody in the church, including me. And is there a way that I can help you grow so that this doesn't keep happening? Right? That would have been loving, right? I might have gotten rebuffed. Right. Might have gotten mad at me and still ended up leaving the church. But at least I would have known that I had fulfilled my shepherding responsibility towards the person and didn't.
So in 2011, 2012, you're going through these conflicts. You're learning about conflict, and you're learning about you're beginning to learn about emotional intelligence and relational intelligence and leading change, right? These are all crucial aspects of leading renewal in a church, growing in these things. And at some point, you pick your head up out of the things you're wrestling with in your church, and you look around like a periscope above water.
Right.
And you're like, what's going on around me? This is when you start thinking, right, about renewal in churches in general,
sure,
not just your own. Can you talk to me about that transition?
Yeah. So actually, it was in the midst of this crazy year of 2011 before it got very bad. But while things were roiling under the surface and I was unaware of it, I walked into a meeting of our leadership in our church with what I thought was a very easy proposal, which was our budget at this point is still good and we're hopeful. And so I walk in with a proposal to our leaders to support our local church planning efforts for a couple $1,000s a year, very minimal amount compared to our full budget. And so I make this proposal to our leaders, and every one of them looks down at the table, and they won't look at me. And I'm like, "What? I'm sorry. Did I say something wrong?" Nobody's talking. And finally, one of the leaders says, "Why would we support something that our presbytery, that's Presbyterian, so it's our collection of churches. Right. Why would I want to support something that our family of churches wants to do? We hate our family of churches." And I was like,
"Oh boy,
whoa!" I had been at the church for 3 years at this point. I was completely unaware of that, and this group of leaders really felt stung by our presbytery because they'd sensed our church had been declining for 30 years at this point. And their sense was that presbytery could have cared less and never lifted a finger to help them. And so why would they want to get along with anything presbytery wanted to do? And I was like, wow, okay. So I took that back to our church plant leader in our presbytery, and he said, "Well, I hear you. We'll help you. Anything that you need now." He said, "I suspect that it's not just you guys, so you know. I suspect, and this isn't good, that it was all of the older churches. As they're planting new churches and new and exciting things were happening, that the older churches kind of got left by the wayside." Well, actually, that turned out to be the case. He was right. The older churches did get left by the wayside. And all I can tell you, Alan, is that God got a hold of my heart. And I was like, that is not right. That doesn't please Jesus. It certainly doesn't live out that connectionalism that we say that Presbyterianism is, right? And so I started what I thought was going to be a simple research project, which was I called some other people that I knew in our denomination, and I said, who are the people that are doing the best, coming alongside pastors that are struggling, churches that are struggling? There's got to be some people that really understand how to do this well. And what I found out was that there was nobody. Yeah. Now the PCA is we're a medium-sized denomination, almost 2,000 works, and there was nobody who was doing substantive efforts to come alongside pastors in struggling churches. Harry Reeder was there with a book and a conference,
right?
And coaching that was very good, but not very affordable by many people.
Right. Harry was on our show recently. They call it Fanning the Flame. It's an excellent way to walk through embers to a flame with your church.
Right.
And it's very kind of targeted and specific, but you're talking about more general walking alongside pastors.
Mm-hmm.
And so while we still love and recommend the stuff
that
Harry was doing, there was you just saw that there was one lone voice in the wilderness out there and not a lot of people bringing energy or resources to this conversation.
Even in our medium-sized denomination, we have 1,000 churches that are plateaued or declining. 1,000.
And that's using kind of giving and attendance and adult baptisms and conversions.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so considering those statistics, more than half of our churches, if you looked at them on paper, we'd say they are plateaued or declining.
Exactly.
And there's one outfit, which is a great one, but only one. That's talking about, hey, how do we turn
and
this
even
around?
their own internal statistics show that they weren't having the effect that they were even hoping to. And so what I discovered was there was this enormous need, and there was very little energy to change it or desire to change it.
Uh-huh.
And so I sort of joined my voice to Harry's, but in a different way, and just began agitating for change. I was on the board for the domestic missions for our denomination. I started to serve on the board and agitate for change because I was like, this is just not right. It's great that we're planting churches. That's awesome that we're planting churches. That's half the heart of Jesus and half the heart of Paul. Yeah, it's awesome. That's half their hearts. Yeah. The other half is with the churches that, going back and visiting the churches and the churches that have all the letters in the New Testament, right? That's the other half.
They go back to established churches to renew them.
Right, exactly. And that wasn't evidenced as a priority within our family of churches, within the PCA. And so that was really the beginning of what later would become obvious was a change of calling for me that evolved over a series of years. So as our church in Seattle recovered from that big blow up and began to grow again, attract new people, we saw some people come to Christ. We saw lots of people matured in Christ. In 2014, I had begun, because of my interest in other churches getting renewed, I had begun doing coaching of pastors and churches, and decided to say, well, I'm kind of doing this on the side, and I'm doing it by the seat of my pants. Maybe I should go get some training. Mm-hmm. And so I went to a training conference to learn how to be a coach, and ran into a guy who was a trainer there named Ted Strawbridge.
Yeah.
Now, if you've ever read our website, you'll have read the name Ted Strawbridge because he ended up later that year of 2014 that we founded a ministry together with Paul Hahn.
So this is where we really shift from Matt's renewal story as a personal, pastoral, leading change in my congregation to let's open up resources and a conversation more broadly about church renewal.
Right.
You meet Ted at the training conference.
Right.
And you intersect with Paul through some denominational work.
Through Ted.
Oh, through Ted.
Ted and Paul had grown up together.
Right. So Ted is a PCA pastor. Paul is a PCA pastor, both with roots in Florida. Matt, you're a PCA pastor. And the three of you begin this conversation. Hey, we should be bringing coaching and resources to existing churches that want to be renewed in the gospel.
Right.
And you form
Flourish
Coaching. So
Flourish
2014
Flourish
Coaching is
right.
formed.
So really so both Ted and Paul, their personal history had been in church planting, but God had gotten a hold of their hearts in terms of church renewal. And so we wanted to start a ministry that found both of these equally important.
Right.
Over time, the Lord took Ted last year to heaven, and the PCA poached Paul, and now Paul works with the PCA. And so Matt was left. I don't have a lot of history in church planting other than having had to learn about it since I had done the renewal of a church that was just this side of planting. And so we're more renewal heavy now than we were probably in the beginning, although I do coach 2 church planters right now. And so we wanted an organization that thought that both of those were important. We wanted to bring together those two halves of Jesus' heart and Paul's heart in a ministry that said both of these are important.
Yeah, and listeners to the podcast will know coming up there'll be an episode with some folks in church planting about the nexus of the two, and we're going to invite Paul Hahn in to have a conversation. He oversees church planting, renewal, domestic missions for the PCA now, and so we want to continue that conversation. But at some point, Paul moves on to work for the PCA. Tragically, Ted was called home to be with the Lord, and we love him, and we miss him, and we love his wife Mary Lou and their family. At some point in this process, between 2014, when the three of you come together, and today, 2020, 6 years later, you go from being a pastor who's beginning to do some work outside of his everyday call,
right,
to now being full-time in the work of church renewal, church revitalization, coaching pastors and churches.
Right.
How did that happen? How did you go from focus on one congregation to this role, thinking about church renewal more broadly? So
in the latter years of my church's life, first, because budget-wise, we had to do it. At one point after the big calamity, I went for 18 months. I was on half salary. And so I had to make money otherwise. And so one of the things I did was I started doing this coaching and consulting stuff to make money.
Yeah.
And but once even our budget got healthy again, we sold that enormous building. We bought a smaller one for cash, and the Lord was kind. We were well provided for. My elders still saw that it was critical what I had begun to do, which was to do work outside of our local church, that they continued to give me an eighth of my time. They let me not be at my congregation.
Interesting.
to work with my presbytery or work on stuff more nationally, because they could see that what they had experienced as a congregation, they didn't want duplicated. They wanted something to be developed that would be different for the future for churches that experienced what they had experienced.
Now, when you say what they had experienced, you mean the downhill side, because at this point your congregation is experiencing renewal, refreshment.
So the downhill side without any attention paid to it.
Right.
Yeah, no resourcing, no care, nothing.
Right.
Yeah.
So at this point, you're taking an eighth of your time. You're working on these issues.
Right.
And change is happening in your church.
Right. Absolutely.
For the sake of listeners, we'll kind of fast forward through. You all sold off the larger building, moved into a place that was more fit for you.
Yep.
You began to see some new growth, new families coming in, more engagement with your local community. A worship director come on team. God is doing some things that are the fruits outwardly of some real inward change in your church.
Absolutely.
And so these things are happening simultaneously. You're getting more involved nationally in this conversation.
Yep.
And your church is experiencing gospel renewal. And at some point, the switch flips.
Right. So the switch flipped in two ways. One was the kind of council advisors I had around me were basically gently pushing on me, saying, Matt, God's called you to this. You really should start thinking about finding a way to transition out of your church. And so I begun to seriously think about that and ponder what that could look like. If you had asked me on June 1st of 2017, Matt, how's your church? I would have said, we are an average American church and we're fairly healthy. We were of average size. We had good health dynamics. It was growing, good times. And between June 1st of 2017 and September 11th of 2017, so through a little bit more than 3 months, we lost a quarter of our congregation.
Okay. And so average size church, you lose a quarter of your congregation
in 3 months.
And almost all of it is moving for work or life circumstances.
Exactly.
This isn't a split.
It's not a split. No, it was there was no presenting issue that produced it. However, the people that moved on were disproportionately younger, more involved in the church, and they lived closer to the church, which left us older with people who drove further to get to our church and who were less involved.
Yeah.
And so we had to, after all of this dust settled, we as elders had to sit back and really seriously evaluate with this quick loss of all of these people who were very heavily involved in our ministry and a proportion of people that were still a part of our church, but for whatever their life circumstance was, were not able to contribute much towards the doing of ministry in the church, right? Trying to be charitable here. We had to honestly evaluate, do we have enough people to maintain a ministry of church?
Right.
And ultimately our decision was that we needed to tell our congregation, we're at that spot where it's just in terms of human capital, right? To keep doing ministry as a church, we probably need to, we're facing either replanting with a different person and a different vision, right? Because we had a facility and we had money, right? Or that we probably we might need to consider closing. Yeah. That was really difficult because it just 3 months earlier, we were at a high point. Yeah. It was bizarre. It was I have to tell you, it was one of the most bizarre providences that I've ever experienced in life. Yeah. And we told our congregation, we don't think that anybody is to blame for this. We squarely put this on the Lord's shoulders because there is nothing that we know of that we have done or anything that you have done that as a result of this. All the people that left, we told people, here's the reasons why everybody left. Call them if you'd like to and verify that we're telling you the truth. Yeah. But here's where we are. We need to take an honest sober assessment. And so the fruit of that process was that eventually as a session, we told the congregation that we thought that the best move actually was to close.
And that's what you all did.
And we did. We voted to close. The church voted 3-1 to close. Wow. And we helped people find new churches, and we took the assets of the church and we gave them to Kingdom Things. And ironically, just before, I'm talking a couple of weeks before the bottom dropped out, I had started a conversation with my elders. And I said, brothers, I really think we need to start thinking about a transition plan for me. And it didn't surprise them because they could see what the trajectory had been. And so they were like, yeah, we see that. We think that's what the Lord wants to do with your life too. And so we had just started the dialogue about how to do a transition plan. What was a great grace about that was that because the Lord had already been pointing me in a new direction, I didn't, thankfully, face what I think a lot of pastors face when a church closes, which is, am I useful anymore? Is this a statement about whether I'm gifted for ministries? Am I doing the right thing? Did I fail all these people? Right? All of those, very easy to have insecure thoughts. All of that was not a part of my experience because the Lord had given me a new place to move towards that I knew was fruitful and would be good. And so we were able to really help people engage what was very difficult for a lot of them. Thoughtfully try and stay emotionally calm for their sake and help people find new churches. And by and large, all those people landed in good evangelical churches, and they brought the growth they'd experienced through us. They brought that with them. Yeah. They brought that missionary impulse with them, that gospel centrality. They brought that with them. Yeah. And we'll still see them. I'll see a bunch of people next Saturday. And it's fun to get back together and hear how God is still at work and how he worked through those years in those people's lives. And I tell people, every church closes. Just sucks to be there at the end. Yeah. And it does. It just does. It was difficult. It was less difficult, I think, because I didn't have those kinds of doubt questions about myself because the Lord already had something new for me. Right. And so that new thing for me was the ministry that I started. I began to have a dialogue with our board, and we decided that, we were going to trust the Lord that what he wanted to do was to move me from that. So I finished the church one day at 11:59, and I started with Flourish 1 minute later at midnight the next day.
I think it's important at this point for us to honestly think about the person who's listening to you talk about church renewal in these podcasts.
Sure.
And they hear you, they hear Flourish, they hear about the things we're doing with different churches, and they, in this moment, might be people that know us know this story, but people that don't know us might not know this story, and they're hearing for the first time, oh, this guy wants to tell me how to renew and revitalize my church, and his church closed. Right. Why should I listen to him? Yeah. Let's just put it bluntly. Why should anyone listen to what you have to say if your church closed?
Yeah. So I think if you look at all the New Testament churches, they all closed. So what
do you mean by that?
Well, they all went out of existence. You look at the church in Ephesus, for example. Yeah. Apostle Paul planted. Probably can't do better than that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, he may have planted it, but so he probably would have been the second touch there. But he was there for a period of time, right? And that's pretty good DNA, right? But it's gone off the rails enough that he has to send him a letter. Then he has to send Timothy there. Then Jesus still has to get on their case, no matter whether you think it's in the book of Revelation, whether you think that's 10 years later or 30 years later, doesn't matter. So churches lose dynamics very, very quickly. And many times it is not related to what the pastor did or didn't do. I'm, in the main, very thankful for the way that God led us and the opportunity and the privilege that I had to pastor that church. And the people who were there, in the main. We're very thankful to have had that opportunity. And we're all mystified that the Lord would do all of that wonderfulness and then say, well, that's the end of this one.
It's interesting. In reality, in almost the same community, a new church of similar tradition was planted, and a lot of your church ended up there too, right?
A third of us?
A third of you ended up in the same community in another church. It's not like the Church of Jesus left that place.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Can I also say that, like, I love you, and I think that what you have to say to people matters and is useful and is helpful. When I get advice from someone and they walk with a swagger, I'm less likely to listen to them than when they walk with a limp. Now, some people like a swagger. I'm not, but they might not want to listen to us. Sure. 'Cause I think everybody that works with Flourish, all of our coaches, we all at some point walk with a limp.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's something to that?
I think so. I think that it's difficult to, well, let me say it from the inverse way. If, say, people go to a training conference and there's the person who's up there who's, strong personality, hard charger, they've been really successful or whatever, and they sit in that audience and inside they're crumbling because they're saying, well, maybe my church could turn around if I was like that person, but I'm not like that person.
Yeah.
And so if this thing is personality driven or temperament or gifting or experiences, if it's not something that I humbly put myself before the Lord and say, Lord, this thing is dead already if you're not in it. The most vital thing here is that you work and that I be as a helpful channel and agent of you as possible here. That's really the posture that the Lord's looking for. Because if the posture is that I can get that done, the Lord likes to laugh at that. That's what the Psalms tell us. The Lord laughs at stuff like that.
Yeah.
He gives grace to the humble. And so I think that there's actually a lot of people that don't respond well, like you, to the person who comes in with the swagger. But the person who comes in and says, I don't have it all together, but I'm willing to share with you what I've learned through time, right? The other reason is one of the reasons why we point to so many resources is that the only way that you grow is that you continue to expose yourself to things that you haven't thought about before and you lean into your growth. And so one of the hallmarks of Flourish is that we do not offer a program. We offer to help your pastor keep developing.
Yeah.
That's what people did with me. That's what continues to happen now. And that to me is the thing. Not are you some person that can kind of pull this off, but are you somebody who's willing to continue to develop? And I think God was kind to us for those years because he worked, humbled me, and made me willing to keep developing, as I continue to do. I've got books in my bag to read on the plane home today because I want to keep developing and lean into a very large pool of advisors. So the things that we teach to people are the fruit of me learning, leaning into not just my own experiences, but into a very large and wonderful literature base of people who this is what they do. This is what they think about of gathered experiences. And so anyways.
Yeah. Well, Matt, this has been a really fun deep dive into your personal experience of renewal and to your experience as a renewal leader in a congregation, and now as someone who is advancing the conversation about renewal more broadly. What do you hope, just in a kind of final bullet point, what do you hope people take away as we start to expand our Renewal Stories series, catching the voices of people who are trying to do this? What do you hope people take away?
Yeah, I think that the person that God is looking for in renewal is the one who's willing to continue to grow and develop. That's what I would say is that if I look back on my story, I am an extraordinarily different person by God's grace than when I started pastoring.
Yeah.
That's the best thing that could possibly be said, is that God hasn't let go of me and he keeps growing me. And to me, that's the hopefulness, right? Is that I think God can use a wide variety of pastors to see churches renewed, but it will take those pastors being willing to continue to grow. And God's made me willing to do that, which is cool.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for coming in and sharing your story today.
Glad to do it.
Right. Well, you've been listening to the Church Renewal Podcast, a ministry of Flourish Coaching. Flourish is here for churches when they feel stuck. We love to come alongside them, help them gain some clarity and renewed gospel hope. If you like what you hear on the podcast, please share it with a friend. Give us a rating and a review in iTunes. That helps further this conversation to other people. Share it on your social media. You can always reach out to Flourish on social media or on our website, flourishcoaching.org. I'm your host, Alan Edwards, Director of Ops at Flourish. You can reach me, Allan, Alan at flourishcoaching.org. Thanks for tuning in today. We love to hear the stories about the ways God is shaping people to lead renewal. We'd love to hear your story, so reach out and help further this conversation with us. We do this podcast. We share these stories because we believe that there is only one fully sufficient reason that this day has dawned, and that is that Jesus is still gathering a people to himself, and the ordinary way he does that is through the ministry of his church. So join us next time as we dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church.